Excellent. Next speaker will be Peter Marquez.
Again, thanks guys for having me, except for you, Earl. I don't even know why. Anyway, I'm not in the launch business anymore. I guess now I'm a consumer of launch, which I guess means I'm in the launch business. So what I wanted to talk about today, a lot of the stuff has already been covered by Joe and a lot of really good commentary by Brett and by Jim Norman. So I'll truncate some of my comments and kind of focus on some policy things and some dynamics in the launch business. Again, my background being in policy, Joe mentioned the space tran policy, and where is the space tran policy, and why isn't there a new space tran policy out? Schrock's having a hell of a time, just to be blunt. When it takes longer to put out a space tran policy than it does to put out a national space policy, it's not because of a failure of intelligence or a failure of imagination. It's because when you get into a specific niche area, the issues become more complex and more interconnected. It's much easier to write a national space policy because it can be flowery and the language can be kind of top level, but now you're dealing with eaches, and it's very, very tough. I think about every other day Schrock leaves a voicemail that essentially says, "I hate you for doing this to me," and then he hangs up. So they're working the policy, but it's, as you've heard from Brett and from Jim and from Joe, and I'm sure you heard from Bill, that this is incredibly complex, and where you pull the strings and what the effect has on the rest of the industry. So since we don't have a space tran policy, we do have the national policy, and the national policy really hasn't changed, I guess, since about in the 1980s with Reagan's policy on space transportation. Essentially, it all says the same thing. Departments and agencies are supposed to work together. They're supposed to, the new part of the new policy is develop hosted payloads and other capabilities that allow for more responsive launch options and provide greater capability. It's supposed to enhance operational efficiency, to increase capacity and reduce launch costs, invest in space launch infrastructure, and develop launch systems and technologies necessary to assure and sustain future reliability in cooperation with the U.S. industry. So, again, you can see it's very easy to write national policy because you can see, oh yeah, that all makes sense, but essentially, what am I supposed to do with that? And so now it's Schrock's job. Schrock got the evil job of having to actually write space tran policy. So what does all that mean? And when we wrote that language, we had a few things in mind. And one is developing small payloads, looking at disaggregation so that you would decrease design and operations costs for payloads, but also increase your launch rate and thereby decrease launch costs and increase reliability. That was kind of the thought where that would go. You'd be launching a variety of launch vehicles, so you'd be right-sizing your vehicle for the payload and thereby increasing the reliability of the other new oncoming launch vehicles. You'd be spending money on launch sites, not just on the actual pads, but you'd be spending money on comms, integration facilities, everything that goes into getting a payload on site, getting a rocket on site, and getting it launched. You'd be providing the option and ability for commercial entities to use those launch facilities. And then government is supposed to be investing in and cooperating with industry in the development of new propulsion systems. About the only thing the government has done so far regarding new propulsion systems has done a ton of study after study after study, not really with industry, but with other people looking at, oh, should we go do this? And of course, every answer comes back, yes, you should go build new propulsion systems. Why we haven't gotten off that dime befuddles me, and I don't know why. So that's what we're supposed to do, but where we are is, we got fragile constellations, and we really don't have any room to lose capability, to lose a launch. Even if that launch is fully reimbursed by insurance costs, not having a particular system on orbit we're at a point where the national security systems are so fragile that we don't have time to have a gap in coverage. And there was comment earlier between Lambert and Norman about national security missions really are critically important. We can't lose one vice a science mission. I think if I went out to Goddard and asked them which one of your missions you could lose, they'd probably say none of them too, because their budget is so small that they have to have the capability and they have to have the payload launched when it needs to be launched. And because we're at this point where everything is so fragile, the budgets are so tight, and the payloads absolutely positively have to be there overnight, the government's paying a premium for that capability to have assured access to space. So, Where I don't want the questions and answers to go, and I don't want the discussion to go, is a fight between the incumbent of ULA and the new competitors. That's not really where the issue is, in my opinion. ULA is providing a service that has been, and they have certain requirements that are put on them by the government. Those requirements increase the cost of launch. Would ULA love to have a low-cost option that competes commercially? I bet you they would. I've heard it from them. I know they would. But they have certain requirements put on them that they have to, that it drives the cost up. And on the flip side, you have other companies that are being paid for services rather than actual requirements on the launch capability. So they're able to provide capabilities at a lower cost than ULA is. It's not because one side is right or one side is wrong. The government customer has said, this is what I want. You have one government customer that says we want it this way, and another government customer that says we want it that way. And the market, at least the U.S. launch industry, is responding to that. The customer is always right. I think in this instance, though, the customer being the U.S. government, doesn't have the full scope of what the impact is of these differing contract vehicles and what it's doing to the launch industry in the long term. Then there are some screwy things with government acquisition and contracting. The OSP-3 contract that is being done says that there are 14 missions being competed under there. In order to qualify for those 14 missions, you have to have 2 certified missions under your belt, which pretty much excludes any new entrants into that. So the incumbent gets essentially those 14 missions. When they do the next OSP contract, you'll have the same certification requirement. You'll have to have flown 2 missions in order to get on the new contract. So if I couldn't fly on the first one and get certified, how am I going to fly on the next tranche of contracted missions when I wasn't allowed to fly on the one before? So you get these kind of grandfathered clauses in where the government says, I absolutely positively have to get there, so unless you're fully reliable, I'm not going to launch on you. But I will launch on you if you do launch. I mean, I don't know how you get stuck off a stupid on that one. It's kind of where we are in the environment. It's not a very pleasant picture. There are things that I think the government can do better at, and one is when you're building a program, put launch in at the very beginning. Let the guys who are program managers determine what launch is and how much they're going to pay for it or what risk they're willing to accept. To draw a bad analogy, when I buy something on Amazon or wherever, I look at how much shipping is going to cost before I click buy it. I'm a single consumer and I'm looking to see how much my shipping costs are going to be. At the end of the day, the government's using your tax dollars. It's your money, and you're paying shipping costs for something to get put into orbit. Don't you think the guys who are running those programs should be allowed to determine how much their shipping costs are going to be? If I'm going to make a choice and I want something really quick, I'm going to choose FedEx, right? Because FedEx has a greater air shipping capability than UPS does. They have about twice as many aircraft as UPS does. If something can only be shipped on the ground, I'm probably going to choose UPS. UPS has 5 times as many trucks as FedEx does, has a greater ground capability. So now I'm able to make a trade. I know who has what greater capability. I'm able to make a shipping cost, and this is on a shipping analysis on a personal level. So I'm able to do this, except the government has precious payloads that what they're doing is essentially paying for a personal valet to get on a chartered flight and take a package from one coast to the other. They don't really have a choice, and this is kind of where the shipping analogy starts to really fall apart, and my analogies are always known for being extraordinarily bad, and this is no exception. But there really is no competition in the government market for particular payloads. I can choose FedEx or UPS, but I can't really choose between other launch providers in the U.S., and I'm really not going to go overseas if I'm the U.S. government as well. No, I think Jim Norman did point out that at least in the medium class we're getting to some level of competition between the Falcon 9 and the Antares, and that is welcome. I don't really see anything in the small market. I completely agree with Jim's assessment that when you launch a small payload once every 3 years, I don't even know how a company makes a business model around doing that. The infrastructure cost alone, the carrying cost of trying to carry something like that, it starts to call into question the reliability of the rocket. It'd be very difficult to keep that going. And then if you're going to compete commercially, I just don't know how you beat the Russians' price on small rockets either. So you've got an issue internally with your U.S. government customer, and then externally you just can't compete on price with the Russians. we're just not competitive overseas at all. And in the meantime, we're busy fighting each other internally. There was the announcement yesterday, the FTC is looking into non-competitive practices by ULA because they're, according to the allegations, they're restricting access to the RD 180 and not allowing other people to use it. No matter what happens in the FTC review and the outcome, one group will lose, and that is the U.S. launch industry, and one group will win, and that's the Russians. And the reason we're there is because, again, we haven't invested in propulsion. Would two U.S. companies be fighting over Russian engines if there was a good U.S. alternative? But we've put ourselves in that position where we've got two U.S. companies fighting each other to provide capability to the U.S. government using Russian engines, and the only one who's going to lose is the U.S. It's just this absurd world that we're living in. So we should be taking advantage of building out propulsion capability. I don't know why we're not doing this. One positive thing we could be leaning towards is that every other nation that is a launch-providing nation has realized that launch is a geopolitical, geostrategic imperative, which means that government has an incredible interest in how the launch programs are going in those countries, which in turn means that government is going to soon, if not already, give those launch companies a nice, firm, warm, Python-esque embrace. And it is very possible and very likely that what is competitive launch overseas will soon become non-competitive launch because they'll follow the practices the U.S. has, which does provide us an opportunity, I think, the next 5 to 10 years to try to right the ship. Use what Brett Lambert very astutely pointed out, use the market dynamics, provide some competition, draw down the costs, let government be a consumer like everybody else, and have the government at least be a partner in building propulsion capability to allow us to go and achieve advantages in the market when other people, I think, are going the other direction. That's just kind of my once over. I think Brett and Jim hit all the spots dead on. I think Joe, as usual, does a phenomenal job pointing out where things are going. So that's it for me. Thanks, guys. I appreciate the opportunity.